All right. Hey, everyone. I'd like to, get started. We only have 2 hours. It's not that long. So I'm gonna give a talk today about blockchain governance and other related topics. It's gonna be a long talk. I'm gonna stop for questions probably. No promises. But if we have time at the end, I'll definitely give you guys an opportunity to ask some questions. But I'm going to do some monologuing, so please bear with me. And if you disagree with any of the things I define or don't define, don't worry about it. They're just definitions. You'll take them as you like it. And if you don't like them, tell me about it later. All right, so here's the kind of outline. We're going to talk about governance, and we're going to talk about law, we're going to talk about politics, ethics, and then I'm going to talk about, I'm going to give a conclusion, which is basically like my opinion. The rest of the stuff, I think, is more, I'm going to try to be more objective. In the conclusion, I'm going to be, it's like a little bit more my opinion. So let's talk about governance. And by the way, each of these sections I'm going to split up into 2 parts. The theory and kind of like how it looks in the blockchain space. So governance is about decisions and kind of other things that pertain to how those decisions happen and things that are affected by those decisions. So everything like upstream from the decisions and everything downstream. Governance is basically like decisions plus like closure on causality around the decisions. I mean, that's like the broadest definition. So it's about the people who are making the decisions, how they actually make the decisions. It's like really kind of relevant to governance, right? Who's deciding? How are they deciding? This is like the stuff of governance. Governance is about the coordination between participants in decision-making. It's about the norms, protocols, and other institutions that they use to coordinate. Governance is about, not just how we make decisions, but how we coordinate around how we make decisions, right? And we have to use tools to coordinate, like norms and institutions of various kinds, infrastructure. So the governance is also about the legitimization and the delegitimization of these institutions for coordination. Like, do we decide to use the EAPs? Do we decide to stop using the EAPs? The EAPs is like a infrastructure that is a thing for coordination, but governance just doesn't include just how we use the EAPs and participate in the EAPs, but also like the fact that the EAPs are legitimate in the first place, and the fact that, and the processes by which we would delegitimize them. So governance really is about politics also. It's about the political process of legitimizing and delegitimizing stuff. We'll talk more about politics later. It's important to forget, though, that governance is also about the people affected by decisions. We call these people stakeholders. And, we'd like to see the stakeholders be affected in nice ways. So, that's kind of like what what governance is about in theory, right? In a little bit more concretely for us in the blockchain space, we have some things to govern. We have a protocol definition / like reference implementations. We use names and trademarks in a way that's common and therefore must be governed. We use nodes that run the blockchain protocol, and they must also be governed. So blockchain governance fundamentally, just because it's a distributed system, it's like software running on the internet, is about the governance of the protocol definition, about the governance of the use of names and trademarks, because this really is what the blockchain is. It's like a software running on a network, and the name is really kind of associated with the blockchain in a way that people use it to discover and use the blockchain and services associated with it, right? If you go to a block explorer and it says it's Bitcoin and then it shows you Ethereum blocks, it's weird, it doesn't happen for a reason. because like people are really careful about how they use names and trademarks because they have to do with representing access to the blockchain. So these are really fundamental things that we need to govern. And so as a result, we fundamentally have certain kinds of participants. The blockchain protocol developers, right? They are fundamentally kind of there because like if someone's maintaining the protocol definition, well, we call them a developer. And so we have protocol developers. We have people who use the names and trademark, right? They're kind of fundamentally involved in blockchain governance. And so are node operators. Node operators are, the people who run the software on the network. Really important. Natural participants who, have no way to escape being participants in blockchain governance because they have to institute the decisions of blockchain governance, right? Like if there's a decision to change the protocol, the developers have to be the one who implement it. If there's a decision to change what name is used to refer to what fork, the people who use names and trademarks will have to implement it. If there's a decision to upgrade the protocol, the people who operate the nodes will have to implement it. So these people are fundamentally participants in blockchain governance. There's no way to disenfranchise them completely. They're always going to be there, just kind of in this fundamental way. But outside of that, outside of the fact that we're using distributed systems, we have a lot of freedom in how to govern the blockchain. Just the fact that it's a distributed system doesn't constrain governance all that much. It says very little about how we should, like in a normative way, govern the blockchain at all, even. It says nothing about the institutions for coordination. It says nothing about what norms we should have. It says nothing about, should we do coin voting? Should we do on-chain governance? What should be automated? There's all sorts of things that aren't mentioned or aren't entailed by the fundamentals. So we have a lot of freedom, really, in how we govern the blockchain. Because there's a lot of ways in which to govern software, and lots of ways to govern names, and lots of ways to govern nodes. So, and especially lots of ways to coordinate all of these decisions. And governance outcomes are high stakes. Very high stakes outcomes we're really talking about because blockchain governance, because the blockchain is like a super powerful thing. Does blockchain governance create a fully autonomous software? It's like a high stakes public outcome. Is blockchain governance going to be captured? By who? By a legal system, by some corporate interests, by a cartel, by a little hybrid. Is using the blockchain legal? Developing the blockchain legal? And where? And if it depends, then on what? These are really outcomes that are going to be determined in part by blockchain governance, and in large part, I would say, by blockchain governance. And we'll get to the legal question soon. Here's one that people talk about a lot in the kind of tech side of things. Will we be able to upgrade the blockchain protocol? Like, this is a big question for blockchain governance. Like, how effectively can we upgrade it, and how much backwards compatibility is actually required? Like, do we need to make sure that all the smart contracts continue working forever? Good question. And there's bigger questions like, what is the kind of power of blockchain governance? Like, what can we do, not technically, but what is like allowed by the governance of the blockchain as a change to the protocol? Or something somehow off limits for blockchain governance. And these are, these are kind of, really important blockchain governance questions. And they determine outcomes, and these outcomes are highly contentious because they're high stakes, and because people have different preferences around how blockchain governance turns out. And this means that blockchain governance is highly political. It ends up being, a real political battle zone where people have political agendas, people have political coalitions, because they vie to try to bring about different outcomes. So we have like big public outcomes that are going to be the result of blockchain governance. Blockchains have strong network effects. And both these things together, especially together, means that like blockchain governance is not going to be a competitive market outcome. It's not like, the result of it's not going to be any open market competition that determines the best governance, and then we're going to have some experimentation, and the winner will emerge naturally through competition. It's not realistically how blockchain governance works. It's, there's strong network effects, and we're talking about public outcomes, and that's not how public politics works. So we're really talking about a really high stakes public issue when we're talking about blockchain governance. Great. Well, that was the blockchain governance, little section, the governance section, but of course the law section and the politics section are also very, very relevant to blockchain governance. So, even though this section called governance and blockchain space is done, I'm still going to be talking about blockchain governance. I guess if anyone has any questions right now, I guess I'll pause. No one? All right, great. So now I'm going to talk about law. And the way I like to do things is I give definitions, abstract definitions, and then I apply them. And I'm more than happy to give overly broad definitions. Much prefer overly broad definitions over overly specific definitions. So here is the definition of legal systems that I use. And I'm going to stick to it no matter what you say, so don't even try to dispute this. So legal systems are protocols for the management of disputes. They are a protocol that may not be a distributed systems protocol in the way that we think about in software. They're administered also by humans. But humans, they follow protocol. And protocol actually was invented in humans before it was in software. And disputes are super diverse things. People fight about all sorts of things in all sorts of contexts, in private and in public, and it goes all sorts of ways. And so the law has evolved to deal with disputes in all sorts of places and contexts, because that's what law is, right? It's protocols for managing disputes, and there's lots of these protocols, and lots of them operating all over the place. They're as diverse and cover many, many of these domains in very diverse settings, because people have disputes everywhere. But we need to, distinguish between the descriptions of legal protocols and their operation, just as we distinguish between protocol specifications and protocol deployments in computer science. There are codes of law, which are descriptions of legal systems. Legal systems don't even technically need to have codes of law to exist at all. It just needs to be a protocol that's implemented and acting to manage disputes. When I intimidate you out of having a dispute with me in some way, if that was a protocol that was not just implemented, but systematically we use intimidation to prevent disputes, as has happened before in different societies, that becomes part of the rule of law. So, and usually it is not codified. We don't say we used intimidation to solve disputes, but everyone figures it out pretty soon, and people have had societies before where intimidation was one of the primary ways that people prevent disputes. And so legal systems don't necessarily, I claim, have to even have codes of law. But, we've evolved a lot of legal systems with codes of law, and code of law is a useful way to tell people and to learn about and to interface with, and for the legal system to have memory, right? Because you write down the code stays there when you look away. Someone else can pick it up later. So codes of laws are really descriptions of legal systems, but they're not the operation of law, which are really the actual executions of those systems, right? The actual administration of the protocols that are used to manage these disputes. And remember, these are really diverse because disputes are really diverse things. There's all sorts of different kinds of disputes, and they happen in all sorts of different places. Disputes are sometimes violent. Dispute management is sometimes violent. And violence causes disputes. So the law naturally has a place in structuring the use of violence. It is, almost synonymous with the term legal system in some people's eyes, because of the fact that disputes are violent and that disputes can sometimes be violent, and violence pretty much always causes disputes. So, and the way that we deal with disputes, because we don't want to have too many headaches and heartaches, is with protocol. Because protocol, as we know, is like a powerful tool for making people not feel personally responsible for stuff. And so it ends up being, much easier if people deal with violence with protocol than if we do it based on people's like individual discretion about, when violence is okay and how to deal with violence in disputes. So, the law really structures the use of violence in society, and that makes people, who are really anti-violence on a principled basis kind of wary of law. But it's important to know that like law operates also disputes that don't involve violence. Legal systems kind of, now pivoting to a somewhat different thought, I got to cover a lot of ground here. Legal systems, they require legitimacy to operate effectively. At the very least, because the people who operate in them need to de facto act as if they have legitimacy to, in a way that's like meaningful and, confident, act as if people are going to use the legal system that they're operating. And whenever you take a legal action inside a legal system, you're de facto acting as if that system has legitimacy. So, law really requires legitimacy to be super useful, because like a protocol for managing disputes that no one uses and that no one recognizes is not a very effective protocol for managing disputes. So legal systems like require legitimacy, and they, have legitimacy as, at least within the people who are using those legal systems. And so it's quite complicated, actually, because there's many, many different legal systems operating in parallel in different and overlapping contexts. They're going to have different codes and different norms that dominate their operation, different ways in which they're operated. There's kind of private law, we think of as like law that operates in private. Really kind of, at the end of the day, I'm not going to define this class really precisely, but things normally we think about in private law are things like contract, like private agreements and the disputes that arise when people don't do what they say they agreed to. Tort, which has to do with like private damages that are caused by people misbehaving or I'm not sure like what the broadest classification is, but has to do with damages. Property law, normally understood, the disputes that arise around property, normally understood to be handled by, private law, meaning legal systems that operate and deal with private disputes that arise kind of in the private sphere. And there's private arbitration and kind of private legal declarations. So people do a lot of stuff in private voluntary interactions in order to manage disputes, in order to prevent disputes, in order to deal with them once they arise, in order to settle them, all in private, right? People really like to keep their disputes private. They don't want people to really see them. Disputes aren't always the most nice thing. And so people, so there's a lot of stuff that just doesn't affect everyone. It doesn't affect a lot of people. It's just kind of, evolves around this culture more around like people's individual intentions and agreements. And then there's like public law, which really arises in a context that's much more public and involves other kinds of operation of law, right? Other kinds of codes of law and other kinds of operation of law. Things like, constitutional law, which establishes the legal basis for the state. Things like criminal law, which involves the penitentiary system, like jailing people, putting them in prisons when they cause public harms and are, deemed by the legal system to be a public risk. There's international law, which operates in a very, very public context. There's public courts and public legal declarations, which are, designed to prevent and manage disputes in public. So when you ask, is my thing I'm trying to do legal? What you're really kind of asking is this going to cause a dispute with someone that I'm eventually going to lose, or possibly lose? And, if you're asking this question, I mean, you may have an idea that you might have a dispute with someone in the future. Just saying, you might have a hint that someone might be upset with something you're doing. Maybe. Because otherwise, why would you care if someone's going to bring a dispute with you and that'll, you know, that you might lose and therefore have to stop what you're doing. So, you know, you kind of know if when you're asking this question, is it legal? You know, like, but I think this is really like the kind of more relevant question is like, you know, or like a better way to frame it, so you don't get stuck into this question of like, oh, is it compatible with a code of law here, or is it compatible with the code of law there? Can I find a code under which I can interpret it like this, or a precedent where I can interpret it like that? You know, instead of trying to think about just the code of law and the law that's been codified, think about the operation of law and the disputes that you're going to have with people who are actually operating the law, or with people who bring suits to the law, right? So if you do something and someone sues you, you know, and you lose that, like it de facto ended up being that what you did was illegal, even though it may never have contradicted a code of law. So, you know, often when you're asking this question, it really does depend. It's really not going to be determinate whether or not someone's going to bring a dispute to you that you're going to lose. It's really not that easy. It's not ever going to be that easy that you can just know when you're doing something, you're taking some action that's going to impact people in a way that they don't like, that they're not going to bring a dispute to you that you're going to lose. It's really hard to tell, you know, in the abstract, or in many cases, in some cases, it's really hard to tell. And this is why it depends is such a common refrain, because you really don't, it really is indeterminate, because we're really dealing with disputes between people. And people have, you know, all sorts of different like means and situations and arguments and cases and intentions, and it's like quite complicated, and depending on what is seen from all the parties on the way by the operation of law, it might go one way or the other often. So, you know, I don't know, but indeterminacy is actually, you know, supernatural in legal systems. It's very, very normal when we don't know how disputes will happen, especially when, you know, we're talking about interesting legal questions, new ones, really. So, and the other thing that kind of really was a super interesting revelation is that, you know, if you try to act like you know how disputes are managed or will resolve when you really don't, there's a really big risk actually that you create losers and winners. If you're like a law person who's providing advice and saying, look, you know, this is how you should behave in order to minimize disputes, and you try to create certainty for people when in fact the legal uncertainty is there, you could really create at least the perception in people's legal matrices, which is like understanding of their legal context, about who the winners and losers are going to be in disputes. And when people disagree, because there's actual indeterminacy and there's different interpretations and cases to be made, you can create disputes by trying to inject certainty into legal arrangements, by trying to create legal theories that things are going to definitely turn out this way if you just behave like that, and don't worry, you won't have any liability if you just do this. Just place that like waiver there, and then, you know, make this incantation here, and you'll be protected. We often create disputes because you make people feel like they can be protected in screwing someone, and thereby, you know, actually create more costs through the creation of the legal determinacy than would be created just by the ambiguity of not knowing whether what you're doing is legal. Now, actually, it's a lot more peaceful a lot of the times if we don't know what you're doing is legal. So, you know, the ambiguity and undefinedness in the code of law is actually a legal asset. It's getting rid of it would create disputes. If you try to make the law more precise, especially if you try to make it perfectly precise, if you try to get rid of all the ambiguity and all the undefinedness, it's not going to be pretty. It's going to create a lot of disputes as you end up choosing winners in disputes and giving people the license to be assholes, because now they can just follow the law and play the arbitrage game. rather than be more tactful in and understanding of the fact that human disputes exist in many contexts and are rather complicated and are not going to be, you're not going to be able to come up with a code that is going to like perfectly tell people in what situations they'll have what liabilities and what obligations and in what situations they have to do what, or else they might lose the dispute. It's not going to happen. The world is way too complex for ambiguity and undefinedness of legal codes to go away. They're really, disputes are complicated. The law is complicated. And so, despite that complexity, though, we want to have some idea of, like, some principles, like, what should law be like? Like, there are legal principles that we sometimes consider and look at in different contexts. Even though the thing is, like, way too complex for any one principle or any one doctrine or to just determine the way that disputes are going to resolve and be managed by these legal protocols going forward. So, here are some things that people talk about sometimes around like what the law should do, right? Should minimize the cost of management disputes, right? Like let people know as much as possible what their liabilities are so that we don't run into situations where disputes arise, right? Provide people certainty about the arrangements in order to minimize the occurrence of disputes, in order so that when disputes happen, we know what to do with them. This is kind of it's a very common law approach. It's like the idea that we should have predictability in the way that disputes are managed. The idea that the way that disputes are managed should minimize the cost of management disputes. At least, that's one way that's how I like to think about it. This is kind of like a, when you think about like law in the context of contract law, we really think about law trying to do trying to bear out people's intentions. Like they're trying to respect what people agreed to and use the facts of the situation to try to make right by what they wanted. So this is kind of like an impartial law that doesn't say what people should want, but just says like, okay, look, it's like kind of like a neutral arbiter of contracts. This is like some people like really want this kind of conception of law, where like we can use the law to create private law with our contracts, just by agreeing between ourselves like how our relationships should be structured. Should it be a tool for equity? For making sure that actually there are remedies to unfair situations in contexts where that's like possible. This is quite a different motivation for law, as is law as public policy, which is a lot of times what people think about when they think about the law. They think about like the legislature making public policy, but of course, legal systems actually is much more diverse than that, because disputes arise in a much more, they're not just public, right? We have disputes are really, really much more complex. So the law isn't just about public policy. And public policy is this like interesting political tool that can be used to do pretty, relatively arbitrary changes. And law can and is often used to institute public policies. What this means is that, rather than thinking about the settling of the dispute in terms of like, just like the relevant facts of the case, also you think about it in terms of the public policy. And, is like, does public policy say that like, it should be resolved that way? So the public policy and the use of law to resolve disputes in a particular way, one that's like more fair or more in line with political goals, is another very, very real use of law, right? Because if you have a political struggle and you're engaged in trying to create some outcome that your political opponents don't like, there's going to be potentially conflict. So you really want the force of law to be on your side so that you win in those disputes. So, the law actually exists in this context that is as political as the context that governance exists in. Because the law is used to manage disputes, and disputes arise in political situations as we fight over contentious high-stakes outcomes. So the law changes with the political times as a result of this reality. And, and that really kind of underscores to me the indeterminacy of law on another level, not just because if you try to specify it too much, you create needless disputes, but because the whole legal systems as a whole can become reformed, abandoned, adopted. So, at the end of the day, law is also a very political issue. Of course, none of this is to say that your lawyers don't know anything about how to manage disputes. I talk about indeterminacy, but that doesn't mean don't heed your lawyer's advice. If they tell you you will get in trouble, I'd say that they might have a hint. I'm not telling you that you won't get in trouble. You might. But at least when it comes to the legal system, that they're licensed to practice law in. So, now I'm going to talk a little bit about law in the blockchain space. But I guess before I do, because that was a big section, I'll take some questions. Anyone? Not taking any objections as to the definition, but I'll take questions. All right, great. Everything must have been crystal clear. So, how do we manage disputes in the blockchain space? How do we prevent disputes in the blockchain space? Especially, as it pertains to blockchain governance, because that's what this talk is supposed to be about. Well, here are some of the things that I've kind of noticed, and I published in my blog post, which you should all read if you haven't already. Find it on my Medium. It's called Against Nick Szabo's Law, or just Against Szabo's Law. So, this is kind of a really basic thing that we do to prevent disputes, is we really, really try, as blockchain developers anyways, to not break the protocol, to not introduce any changes that will make the thing crash, because we know for a fact that that will lead to disputes. When the protocol breaks, people get angry, people are relying on the protocol. It's very much not pretty, even when the protocol is kind of broken, kind of flawed and could be broken, and then you fix it. People still get upset, They get really upset even about flaws that weren't exploited. So if they do get exploited, people get even doubly upset. So a really, really important way that we prevent disputes is by not breaking the protocol and not basically so think of it as in terms of engineering. You build a bridge, you want to make sure that the bridge doesn't collapse, because then people will get really upset with you, especially if there's people riding on that bridge. It's a very natural law that emerges. I call it don't break the protocol. And it's a law because it's something that people use to settle disputes in the blockchain space. And to bring disputes and to make sure that they settle in your way. If you try to propose a patch to the blockchain, as a kind of decision in blockchain governance, and I can find a critical flaw in it and make that case, I can, without a doubt, block that upgrade. We also prevent disputes with pre-existing legal systems. I call this one keep crypto law legal. We do a lot, actually, to structure our affairs so that we don't have people sue us, so we don't have people come and bring and tell us that, we're breaking the law in some way. We have contractual waivers of liability. We act as if and are told by lawyers that code is protected speech. And we structure our affairs so that we don't need a license. And if we do need a license, I guess we get one. You can really see this in the whole exchanges and money services, businesses in the blockchain space. But even developers really take care of their liability. So we really, really structure blockchain governance and our affairs in order to prevent disputes with existing legal systems. Kind of just by necessity, but also because we operate in public, right? Whereas lots and lots of us are public people who operate in public, and so it's really hard for us to avoid getting sued and to avoid scrutiny by publicly operating legal systems. So we structure our operations to keep crypto law legal. By crypto law, I mean the operations of the protocols that resolve and manage disputes in blockchain governance, just applying the definition. And finally, we have this other law in blockchain governance, which we use to manage and prevent disputes, which is a pre-commitment to not do anything unless it's related to tech maintenance. So if you can't pass off a change as if it's related to the maintenance and sustaining of the technology, then according to Szabo's law, shouldn't happen. And this is a law that, you know, we kind of have grown up with in the blockchain space through the mantra of immutability, of autonomous software in the form of smart contracts, which are supposed to create the certainty, this legal certainty, that is provided by the autonomous to-the-code execution of software. Code is law. That's the effect of Szabo's law, that we should, in managing disputes around blockchain governance, not do anything that interferes with the continued operation of the chain. So all that's allowed is maintenance. All that's allowed is autonomous software. But as we kind of learned and our understanding of the legal system, it's not the only law. There's lots of legal systems in operation, and some of them might not see your code as law. They might disagree with you that the software must not change. They might not think that it has anything to do with their operation of their legal system, and they're, you know, probably right. Although they might interpret your intentions in some context around that software. You know, while code is law under Nick Szabo's legal system, where in the sense that, like, you know, the way the code runs is the way that the disputes are resolved. It's the only real. I mean, I don't know any other legal system really that kind of is into this kind of automation of code as law. And we kind of have this code as law thing thanks to Nick Szabo's legal theories that he spread throughout the blockchain space. And he has this kind of perspective of law that's really, really based in private law. All interactions with the software is voluntary. This is what you signed up for. You can't complain. This is like the paradigm of crypto law today. You know, this is what you got. You know, you have this like a liability waiver for the developers. The software is provided as is. You use it voluntarily. Smart contracts are in the same way. You use them only voluntarily. And so this is all just something you opt into. And so the theory is somehow that this is all going to be all legally okay. However, by essentially using the law, using private law, using waivers of liability, code as speech, theories about what developers should do to minimize liability, namely nothing, except for necessary as maintenance, Nick Szabo and his ilk have legalized, through the system of resolving and managing disputes in the blockchain, fully autonomous software. And this has placed crypto law in an aggressive, really aggressive posture vis-a-vis existing public legal systems, where fully autonomous software would never be allowed, especially because it's publicly operating. And what Nick Szabo's law really does is it forces an extreme minimization of crypto law. There's nothing that crypto law can do to manage disputes by providing remedies or changes to the blockchain protocol if that can't be passed off as maintenance of the protocol. So it creates a minimization of crypto law as a way to manage the disputes around blockchain governance. It enforces a minimization of blockchain governance. It means that blockchain governance is only supposed to do the minimum amount of stuff required to maintain the autonomy of software and nothing else. It's really incompatible with any of the legal principles that we talked about earlier. It, doesn't care about the facts of the situation. It doesn't care about equity. It doesn't care about public policy. It doesn't care about political aims. It really is just about legal and political minimization. Because it was motivated and created in Nick Szabo's legal thought and his political theories, which are radically anti-law and anti-politics. They really radically believe that law and politics are completely unworkable and shouldn't even be tried, and that we should not make any decisions because that is more socially scalable, is the argument, than law or politics could ever be. But thankfully, because of the way that law and politics works, this it depends kind of fashion, we aren't stuck with Szabo's law. As much as they want to say that it's decided, as much as the Bitcoiners say that the nice thing about Bitcoin is that governance was solved before it was even public. It isn't solved, and we're not stuck with it because law and politics are really indeterminate systems. We can, I believe, do much better. Is it even the most cypherpunk law possible? I mean, he tried to come up with a really, something, he's a cypherpunk, he's a cypherpunk with a law hat. And he tried to come up with the most cypherpunk law that he could. And I really don't know if that's the most cypherpunk law possible. Code is law. Whose code? Anyone's code. And where does it operate? Everywhere. I don't know if anyone's code operating anywhere in this hyper-private law paradigm is anything close to what a cypherpunk tradition should be like. If we're going to use protocol and cryptography to be involved in collective legal and political action, is it really going to be a radical private law system where anyone can write their own and impose it on anyone, anywhere in the world? I hope not. And so I think we have a lot of naivete in the legal thinking in the blockchain space. We think that we can reduce legal uncertainty and do it by creating fully autonomous software. But that's crazy. Fully autonomous software just creates a needless conflict. It's not going to reduce legal uncertainty. We're going to have way more disputes than we're ready for. There's really, and I mean, I guess of that it's certain. And so there is some uncertainty that's reduced, but it's not certain how those disputes are going to turn out. Is code going to be speech? Or is the fact that now we can use protocol to institute a huge variety of kinds of organization, that code is more than just speech, and that this dispute around the protection of developers as they do whatever they want with protocol is going to arise, and I don't think anyone knows how that's going to go. Although people would love to say they know, act like they know, and create certainty and allow people to release the beast. So I think we can find actually a much more comfortable crypto legal system. I think we could actually do much better than the denial of our responsibility to manage disputes and to actually understand that we have disputes that are going to arise in blockchain governance that do arise and that today are, settled only with the dismissal that we can't do anything. So I think the legal thinking in the blockchain space is very immature and very escapist. I hope you agree. What time is it? How much time do I have? Can anyone tell me how much time I have left? Sorry? I have 1 hour left? Okay, great. So let's talk about politics. So politics is in theory, describes the struggle for power and governance between different interest groups. It really is about this political struggle for different outcomes that different groups prefer. Political thought is about considering the political order, which is like, the distribution of who has what power in governance. It can be, impartial, or it can be with respect to developing a particular political agenda. Political discourse is kind of the public and private discussion and conversation and signaling that we use to coordinate our political thoughts and actions in order to potentially have an impact one day on the political order. Political bickering, as some call it. Political action is, action that's intended to impact the political order. It is, activism, voting, even running a blockchain protocol. There's a lot of political action that people take in the world as they try to maneuver in this very real political struggle into positions of power and governance to determine the shared outcomes that, determines winners and losers in political struggle that is involved in these really, really high stakes games. So politics describes the formation of political classes along the lines of interest shared in governance decisions. It's very natural stuff. Here are some examples of political issues. The balance of individual freedom versus collective responsibilities. Geopolitics. National elections, gender politics, data protection, gun control, immigration, climate change. There's a lot of public stakes that are under the kind of purview of political struggle, and that the result of political struggle will determine, and has determined so far, and will continue to determine going forward. So, politics is super real. It's a really high stakes game, and we really exist in a political context. And of course, politics is also about the struggle for power in the legal system, for roles of power in the legal system, both in setting the code of law and in operating the rule of law, or operating the system of law. And of course, politics involves the use of legal action and legal systems, because politics involves the pursuit of outcomes that will create conflict and disputes, and you don't want those, and if you want to win, using legal protocols is just part of the modern arsenal, because we have legal systems that are operating with enough legitimacy that they can be really important tools. And even if you're not talking about legal systems that you're using, just the legal declarations, legal example, legal thought can create political consequences as you manage disputes through the declaration of your intentions, through the declaration of your worldview, and so people understand how you're going to relate to them. And so even through the individual use of legal action, we can engage in political action. So, and politics, so it's kind of really, nowadays, law is really indispensable for politics as a result of the fact that politics has so many disputes and that law is commonly used in the management of disputes, and people really expect it. So, as a result, really, law has both sinister and liberating role in politics. It has the opportunity to be used to impose the code of your enemies onto your people. It also has the opportunity to be liberating, as it makes sure that disputes are resolved in ways that are favorable to your cause, as opposed to in a way that favors this established political order, for example. So, this is always the question, whose law? For what ends? Enforced against who? These are really kind of questions that make people really both afraid of the operation of law, especially as driven by public policy, and really enamored by it as a way that they could liberate themselves from the influence of the people who are currently in power in the political order. So it's an interesting question. Like, what should the role of law be in politics? I mean, I don't know. Just a thought. So, you know, the blockchain space is actually very, very political. It's very politically motivated. It was really born out of a place of legal and political action. It was always about giving people the agency to use this technology in a way that, you know, will provide them freedoms that they didn't have otherwise. It's always been a liberational force that people have taken up, you know, through their own personal, political, and legal actions as something that they want to use to defend themselves against their political opponents. It's being used for public political action, right? These blockchain governance outcomes, as we described, are public outcomes. And, you know, protocols are actually much more powerful now thanks to blockchain technology. You know, before the blockchain, we didn't really know how to have public protocols that are stateful, and now we do, and that, you know, we think is a big deal. And that means that we can use protocol to do political action in a way that's much more powerful than could have been before. And so blockchain space was always about using protocol for political action. However, for the most part, the kind of belief and worldview that people have in the blockchain space is that public politics and law are unworkable, that they're better to not be tried. They're better to just completely abandon and not participate because, you know, law is corrupt, politics sucks, and that's just fundamentally the way it is and the way it has to be, and it doesn't matter on the particular arrangements of the legal system, the particular arrangements of the political order, or of whatever legal and political actions you might take. However, unfortunately, the minimization of law is legally unworkable because it puts crypto law in a collision course with existing legal systems. It is an aggressive posture that says, we're not handling disputes here, nothing we can do for you. And the minimization of politics is unworkable because really it imagines a system that is destined for war in the sense that it has an outcome it's going to pursue, and it is not willing to engage in any politics, engage in any compromise in getting in going for that outcome. It says, I have my political action, I'm not going to engage in any politics, I'm just going to act to make the future that I want to see for the world. And I think that's politically unworkable because it's not politically very mindful of the way that, like, other people in politics will behave. You know, I feel like I can argue that better, and I think is coming. So, you know, the political thought here in the blockchain space says that we need, for our political ends, fully autonomous software. But it actually doesn't come close to being optimal for achieving any particular goal, because fully autonomous software is not close to being optimal for achieving any real political aim. Software doesn't do what you expect, and so it's really hard for it to be optimal for anything, especially if it's fully autonomous. I mean, if we can patch it and change it as we go, maybe it could be useful. But fully autonomous software is not really optimal for any single political end, other than perhaps the minimization of public politics, which, you know, in the determination of the future of software, which is an insane political goal because it doesn't care about public politics, and which basically means it doesn't care about the political futures of the public. And so I think that's really politically unsustainable. So we have a really politically active and politically confused blockchain space today. You know, we want to use legal action and political action to create a change in the world, and we want to deny at the same time that law and politics have any place in our own governance of our own affairs, in our own governance of our own protocol, of the trademark, etc. So, we're really, I think, could use a lesson in politics as much as we can use a lesson in law. So now, but since we're talking about these really high stakes political outcomes and determining them through political action without participating in political discourse, I think it's a good opportunity for me to talk about ethics. Unfortunately, I was rushing my slides, so these next slides are a little bit minimalistic. I apologize. So what's the right thing to do? That's kind of like what ethics is concerned about, and specifically in the context of social interactions and the socially beneficial thing as opposed to the selfish thing. So when I'm talking about the right thing to do, I don't mean for you in your individual materialistic struggle in your own rational worldview. I'm talking about the right thing to do in a social, publicly defensible way, not in the, rational, private way. So, there's a bunch of things that people who study ethics have come up with in their pursuit of figuring out the right thing. One of them is this veil of ignorance idea, that you should act as if you don't know who you are in the situation, and that the ethical system is the one that you would prefer if you didn't know who you got to be. It's a way to be impartial. The categorical imperative is something that says that, you should only act in a way that you think that other people should also act. It's kind of like this other attempt to provide a neutral frame for deciding how to behave in an ethical way. It's trying to move away from just doing the selfish thing. There's a lot of ethical thought that is levered against injustice. Similarly, seeing how people treat each other in a really shitty way that you wouldn't want to be treated, and which causes, this thing we call injustice. And, ethics, in some, generally is concerned about evil and not doing evil things, and is leveraged against, for the most part, injustice. And this is I think part of the ethics thing, as opposed to the just doing what's right for you thing. I think this is another one that I think is super important. Respecting people's agency. It's a nice thought from, some ethical philosophy somewhere, I don't really know. Where, somehow people should have the ability to determine their own lives and not just have their lives be determined by you and not have you dictate how you should live. And this is an important, I think, principle, at least something to keep in mind when thinking about how things should be in when you're engaged in, say, political struggle where you're ready to tear down your opponents. Respecting human dignity is another kind of important thing in ethics. Not making people super traumatized to a point where they can't recover. They're keeping people feeling like they can respect themselves and their place in the world. These are kind of important things for in ethics, at least, maybe. I mean, ethics is complicated also, it turns out. There's taking responsibility and doing it in a way that's responsible. This is also some ideas that come up in ethics. You have to make sure somehow that you're mindful of the consequences of your actions and aren't recklessly causing people damage, or and when you take responsibility to make things good or make things right somehow, you do that in a way that's mindful of the consequences of your actions. This isn't at all an overview of the theory of ethics or anything, but so this is the last thing in my list. Ethics actually ends up being quite different in desperate circumstances. The grounds that you need to justify your actions as ethical when your life is in danger, when the stakes are super high and you have to act immediately, a little bit lower. So ethics actually ends up being a little bit complicated because it's very dependent on the context of the actor. And so as you maybe suspect, we're pretty naive in the blockchain space when it comes to ethics also. you know, pretty bad on law and politics and governance. Why would we be any better on ethics? We have a lot of ethical escapism. We have a lot of people who act like they're working on technology when that's the convenient narrative, and who act like they're self-righteous cypherpunks when that's the convenient narrative. You know, just working on technology, cypherpunk activist, just working on technology, cypherpunk activist. Yeah, I mean, you know, there's a lot of selective ethical escapism. We kind of believe, really, that what happens on the blockchain is not our individual responsibility. It's like a really shared belief. It's not us, wasn't us that did this. You know, we may be involved in some role here. You know, I'm building the protocol. You know, I'm maintaining this little bit. You know, even though like our collective actions have this effect, individually we're not responsible. And I think that that is, you know, a super powerful tool when it comes to political and legal action, and when it comes to ethical responsibility, it's pretty weak, in my opinion. But ethics is complicated and context dependent. And we really believe somehow that we're doing the right thing. And well, here's how I can rationalize it. Desperate times cause for desperate measures. Like somehow we found ourselves in such a politically and legally desperate situation that it has become ethical to do this, to take, at least from, not necessarily ethical, but justifiable for our conscience, apparently, to take this political legal action without engaging in political and legal discourse, to try to bring this change to the world, to create fully autonomous software to enable a world of private, voluntary interaction. So that's kind of the theory somehow, is like we're in a really rough spot. This is a theory that justifies, like, this is like as far as we come with ethics in the blockchain space. It's like we're in a really desperate situation because of the legal and political order of the world, which is based on this legal and political systems that are inherently unworkable, and therefore we have to create, through political and legal action, a fully autonomous software without really being involved in any kind of public policy debate. Because it's really desperate. It's a really desperate time. It's not really a place for a global political discussion. It's a place for private political action to overturn the global political order with the creation of autonomous software. And we justify this with desperation, because it's really just the only thing we can do. Everything else won't work. It's a desperate time. And this today is, I think, the ethics of blockchain. That's where we're standing. So I think we can do, you know, a lot better with our collective posture in law, in politics, in governance, and in ethics. So I want to talk about posture a little bit. Posture is kind of your positioning, especially as it signals your intentions, especially as it's visible to other people, whether intentionally or not. You know, posture is kind of like a positioning that you take in order for some reason, you know. Usually you're trying to, it's because you're doing something. Here I'm standing to you as if I'm talking to you. You know, you're sitting over there as if you're listening. The postures that we take really have to signal what we're doing in that moment and what our intentions are in that moment. And there's not that much you can do about your posture when you have a particular goal or when you're a particular constraint. I don't really have much. I have to stay between these two lines. I have to hold the microphone to my face. You guys kind of have to sit there. And so the posture that we have is really determined by the actions that we're taking in the place that we inhabit in the world, the position that we take. And the blockchain space really has an insecure and aggressive posture with respect to existing legal and political systems. We are insecure in our ability to engage in law and politics. We're aggressive in our pursuit of our political and legal ends. We're, you know, we act like we don't need to engage in legal and political processes, but we have political and legal ends, and we aggressively pursue them. We have this posture that I think is not super helpful. And I think actually the governance of our collective legal and political and ethical posture is like the single biggest blockchain governance problem that we have. We have this real cultural issue around what are we intending to do and what is our position with respect to society. And right now, we're super aggressive and insecure. And I don't think it's a good look, and I don't think it actually helps us. I think we can be much more secure in our relationship with legal and existing political orders, not necessarily saying that we should give up our political aims or our legal aims. But I think we can be much more secure in the way that we're positioned. I think we need some humility in the context of the political situation that we find ourselves in, which is much bigger than our ability to understand it fully. We have only individually, anyone, a small view of the political landscape. And we need to be humble in the context of the political arena, as opposed to, with hubris thinking that, fully autonomous software is just the thing that we need. For sure, definitely. We need to understand that there's people's interests on the line in these high-stakes outcomes, and that they're involved in real political struggles. We need to not be dismissive if you're in power of these people's interests. Even if it might be inconvenient to hear about how your decision or lack of decision are impacting them. We need to be willing to hear arguments and information, but also people's interests and what is going to hurt them or be good for them from their point of view. We need to not just be focused on the technical questions, but also on the political questions. We need to have kind of this faith and optimism that our coordination through political process can produce better results than any one of us can through unilaterally imposing our will on others. We need to really believe that politics is worth it and workable, as opposed to our current operating system, which is that fuck politics. Or at least, it's not our operating system, that's like the narrative that we have, or like more like the conceptual understanding. It's not at all the real life, where we have to deal with politics just as a part of governance. And we need to really understand that the political struggles that we're involved in are not free of conflict and of real trade-offs between people's interests. And that these actions, these individual and collective political legal actions of the kind that like running a blockchain really is like a necessary and normal part of the political and legal process. So I think we need to, have a posture that is much more peaceful and that is willing to like struggle in politics and law to have a peaceful outcomes, as opposed to one that is certain that it's destined for war and that is certain that it's going to like, impose its will on people no matter what they want and no matter what is their stake in this outcome. I think we need to have a much more peaceful posture if we want to have a much more secure blockchain governance system. And I think that, but also at the same time, I think that, we do need to care about public issues enough to go to war. I'm not saying that we shouldn't go to war no matter what. I'm saying we shouldn't act like war is predestined. We shouldn't act like we're in such a desperate situation that we need fully autonomous software to achieve our political aims and that we need to create it through private legal and political action. And instead, imagine that we can involve ourselves in public political and legal processes, and that war is not predestined, that we don't need to privately impose our will on the public in order to achieve our political ends. I think we need to adopt a posture that's much less deterministic, much less ruthless, and much more open to the indeterminism, ambiguity, complexity, and it depends answers that is really characteristic of the kind of systems that we are dealing with. And we're dealing with open systems that are prone to change due to context, not closed systems that should run autonomously no matter what happens outside of them. By creating autonomous software, we're maximizing the paperclip. Sorry if you don't get that reference. It's like a rationalist thing. Anyways, so that's kind of my, my real conclusion here is that I think we really need to change our posture from this like aggressive, insecure world where we're trying to impose our legal and political will through our private action on the public, to a world where we're willing to engage in public discourse, in public law and politics, in order to prevent the kind of war that we think is necessary in order to bring out our political actions, but which really probably isn't quite as necessary and certainly doesn't warrant fully autonomous software. Like, let me say this. If you wanted to go to war with the blockchain, fully autonomous software would not be the most effective way to do it in almost any circumstance, because like it probably isn't going to do what you expect, and you probably are going to have to patch it if you really want it to work well. So no matter what your goal is, no matter what your political situation, I don't think fully autonomous software is the right thing for you. I don't think living in a world that's fully deterministic and that where you know the way that the system is going to evolve for certain is going to reduce your legal uncertainty and your coordination costs. Quite the opposite. You know, I think we need to understand that we don't know, that these political outcomes are undetermined, that blockchain governance is undetermined, and that you know, we have a lot of room in that indeterminacy to be reasonable and to make compromises in order to prevent conflicts and to not create situations where we just let people screw each other with impunity, where we let people experience huge public costs and we act like it's not our responsibility. I think we can adopt a posture that's much more effective for our political aims, and it's much more ethical by like abandoning our culture of legal and political and ethical escapism. And that's like kind of my opinion. So thanks for listening. Yeah, there's a lot of questions. I guess we have a microphone that's going to go around. Thank you so much. I want to provide a hat tip to Boris over there, who helped open my consciousness up to a lot of this stuff in the last year. Right there, that's him. Go talk to Boris. If you have any questions, he'll know better than me. Maybe, you know.
Vlad, this is the other Boris.
Oh, hi, Boris.
Vlad's and Boris's, good theme. Great as always to get your definitions. Now it's our job to corral you down to more concrete things. So I have a very concrete question to start things off. Do you think that a coin vote or similar implementation is a way to get broad stakeholder representation of the Ethereum network?
No. Because most people in the Ethereum network are not, you know, having the same number of coins. And so what you end up having...
I'll actually put it in a... what method do you propose to engage broad stakeholder inclusion on decisions in the Ethereum network?
Great, that's a great question. So there's different stakeholder groups that are, you know, kind of, somehow you can think of them, at least from a political point of view, as being defined by their shared interest. And so ideally, we would have we'd be able to identify different stakeholder groups and identify ways to securely hear from them what their opinions are. And I say securely because this is a high-stakes outcome where there's a big incentive to try to make it seem like different stakeholder groups have different opinions. And some stakeholder groups, like miners and coin holders, have a really natural anti-Sybil mechanism, but other ones, like users, developers, don't. And there's all sorts of different kind of community members. And so like my own kind of feeling is that people need to create legal and political voices for the stakeholder groups that they're part of. So if you feel like you're part of, you know, the crypto law lawyers in crypto, Stakeholder group, you know, maybe Coin Center, you feel like they can represent you. I don't know, maybe not. But basically, there's going to be a bunch of people who are kind of somehow faces of the crypto lawyers Stakeholder group, and there are probably going to be some. I'm not sure if there are yet, but you know, it's going to happen. And people, when they participate in politics, end up creating ways to signal their interests as they participate in political discourse and try to coordinate. And so I think we shouldn't try to, you know, impose on people how exactly they represent themselves, but we definitely need to encourage and listen for interest from different stakeholder groups if we care about good faith participation in the political kind of process. Or if we care about even just strategic participation. I hope that was okay. Whoa, we all, you know, we all.
So maybe this is less of a question, more of a response in defense of Nick Szabo and the power, I think, of what he has stated. I mean, you say it's he, but I think it's kind of more accepted as a general principle. And it's this, which is that you miss the beginning when you talk about where the law gets its legitimacy from. You're missing this bit, which is it gets its legitimacy from the state, and the state has this one thing which no one else can have, which is the monopoly of violence. So if you've ever been to a court before and ever been judged, you'll realize there's this moment where you go, shit, it doesn't matter what my opinion is anymore. The judge can just put me in prison or fine me or do whatever, because they have the state, and the court is one manifestation of that, has the monopoly of violence, right? So if the blockchain ecosystem decides to stand under that voluntarily, in this case, as you would propose, then you also have to realize then the state then does have a monopoly of violence over you. It can imprison and jail and fine anyone it wishes if you voluntarily accept that. The power of Nick Szabo's response is this: hey, it isn't to do with us. This protocol just runs on its own. It's like trying to sue nature. And that's really powerful, because then how can you imprison an earthquake, or like King Canute?
Yeah, but it's also but it's also bullshit, you know? I mean, it's like really powerful bullshit that, like, you know, because it's not a force of nature, it's a protocol that we, through our norms, are making like a force of nature and trying to pretend like we're not responsible. When really, you know, it's not a force of nature, it's a distributed system in software running on nodes on the internet. It is, you could pretend you're not responsible, but I don't think it's like really like a sustainable worldview, because I don't think actually that it's very realistic. It's just extremely simplistic. Even the conception of the state as a monopoly on violence, I think, is a little simplistic. Of the law as being provided legitimacy by the state, I think, is way simplistic. You know, I think that the, you know, like, for example, like legal thinkers created the Constitution, which provided legitimacy of the state. So obviously, like, the law existed before the U.S. government did, and actually was used to conjure the U.S. government into existence. It's like a legal entity.
Well, actually, but most legal systems didn't start like that. They started off with a king, right? And so it derives from there, which makes the US quite different in that regard. If you come from Britain, you know where the line of legitimacy lies, and it makes for a very different reading of history.
Well, I mean, even if the king has an important role in law, you know, it's not like the king created the law. I mean,
no,
I don't know.
That's exactly what happened, and that's the point. That's why people around the world who aren't, let's say, just in America, are desperately afraid of their governments. And that's really important, because it turns out governments have powers like kings and dictatorial powers that could write the law and enforce punishment, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what makes these things very, like, if you suddenly say, okay, well, look, we should get involved in politics.
But the autonomous software thing doesn't prevent disputes with the legal system. It creates them. You know, it doesn't do a good job of existing in the context of the violent disputes that could be brought with the power of law. I mean, I don't really believe that fully autonomous software is like the only natural response to the existence of corrupt legal systems. I think that we have way more breadth of action in the context of the operation of law than to act like we have nothing to do except for maintain the software. And I think that it's basically an overly radical response to, instead of being a more based on a realistic understanding of the world, it's based on a radical ideological reactionary understanding that says that law and politics are fundamentally going to be used in this way, and somehow that therefore we shouldn't govern software. It's really a very, very, I mean, it's an argument that's full of holes and of simplistic legal theories and simplistic political thought that it doesn't stand to modern analysis, I think. It's like, it's very, very, very radical and very much oversimplistic and not, you know, in proportion to the complexity of the situation.
I think there is a natural tension, almost incompatibility, in line with what you are saying, is politics requires deliberation, and deliberation is anything that is not automatic. So that's why what happens is when you say that, and I totally see your point, that if you do political minimization, then you take the right from me, say as a user of blockchain, to deliberate on some of these matters. So what happens is we are doing a category mistake when we are saying that automatic software should not have political angle to it, because we are confusing between symbol mapping in a CPU and processors, which is automatic, and between the deliberation of human actors living their lives, doing their things. And also interestingly, because I have lived in a totalitarian regime, and so you know that if you do not let people deliberate, it's actually dictatorial posturing. So it's almost like you're hiding behind the software. You know, it's what I call the Vegas adage posture, which like what happens in blockchain stays in blockchain. I have nothing to do with the blockchain. Don't talk to me if you didn't get your funds back. You know, that's a Vegas posturing which which dictators use. And in fact, Macron in France has even commented, and there's some debate about this, that there's too many checks and balances, all these legislators and all, but you just have the executive powers. You know, it's like if Sabo wants executive powers that developers should have, it's, I mean, it's not automatic, it's deliberation, but that's the point. So there should be a nice balance between deliberation, which is political, and automatic, and we should not confuse the categories.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think I totally agree with you that, you know, shutting down political discourse is, you know, very characteristic of totalitarianism and of, you know, basically the imposition of political will. But I also think that politics is also about legal action as much as it is about discourse. You know, discourse is kind of the nice way out, but legal action is sometimes extremely empowering and isn't always wrong. It's not always imposing your will on people and to force them to eat shit. It's often just liberational. And, you know, it's important to not think that just because someone is taking a legal action without participating in discourse, that they are necessarily acting in bad faith. You know, it depends and it's complicated.
Hey, Vlad. So in political theory, one distinction between a counterculture and a social movement that's been made is that they have different loci of contention. So a social movement is a counterculture is I'm trying to change your mind about something. And that if enough people's minds change, then something will get done. Whereas a social movement is a self-politicized, so you have some kind of name, movement that is trying to get something specific from the hegemony, I think in this case a state, that they're a part of. So with this kind of definition, my question for you is, would you consider the blockchain space a counterculture or a social movement?
Sorry. So counterculture is trying to change people's minds individually. What's a social movement again? Sorry.
Social movement is enough of those people have gathered to try to get something from the hegemony they're a part of.
I'm not sure. No, I think it's much more private legal action. You know, it says like, look, I can identify that within my like established legal and political turf, I can take this action that will have a consequence that's better for my position. And lots of people are doing this individually. And because they believe, due to the contractual waiver of liability and the idea that code is speech, that they can take this action. Or they believe, because of, you know, whatever legal arrangement that they have, that is within their political and legal, you know, safe zone, to take this action and that will have these consequences. So I think it's actually much less about convincing people than than like a lot of political action around that's organized around, say, legislatures or voting. It's much more of a direct political action.
But if they're not self-politicized, so like we say the blockchain community, right? But there's no political party of the blockchain space. And
well, there's camps.
There's camps. Sure, there's camps. There's camps. But I guess my thought is that if, by definition, to get something from the state, you have to be willing to interact with it, does that mean that until we have some larger entity of a self-appointed political party of the blockchain space that will actually get anything done?
I mean, we're already getting so much done, it's terrifying. So I don't know exactly what you mean. I mean, people are passing laws, people are doing all sorts of crazy stuff. I don't know. I think that, you know, I'm not sure the extent to which we need political representation in existing systems in order to posture ourselves in a way that's sensible with respect to existing systems. Not in a way that gives up our goals, but in a way that isn't so aggressive and insecure, because actually we don't need to today have that kind of posture, because cryptocurrency, 10 years later, more or less legal for now.
Yeah, thanks for the talk.
My pleasure.
I think mainly what you're saying is, okay, Saba's law and cypherpunk ideals have led to a situation of legal, government, political, ethical escapism, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sure, and you say that's bad, and I think a lot of people, whether they agree with you or not, are really wondering what's an alternative, right? Can we make something up more concrete? Because what we're now kind of doing is like having a discussion on a meta level about whether something's good or bad without talking about actual alternatives. And I think that's also what the first question was kind of about. Can we make this more concrete? You know, are you thinking about terms and conditions for the use of blockchain? Are you thinking about contractual relations between miners? Are you thinking about governmental, you know, institutions within blockchains? What do you think?
I mean, I think all of these are interesting questions, like super interesting questions, and I'm thinking about them. I don't know if I'm ready to like give any concrete proposals, if that's really what you're asking for. Although I do think I have like relatively concrete things that I think we can do, like, you know, including, you know, having abstract conversations and accepting indeterminacy as a reality, which doesn't sound super concrete, but actually, it'll lead, I think, and this is why I'm doing it, to concrete changes that will like improve our ability to develop blockchain governance. Because today, instead of having the disputes that arise in blockchain governance help us with blockchain governance in the future, they're dismissed and left unresolved. And people just get upset and build up resentment. And I think we're missing a lot of opportunities to develop blockchain governance. And I don't think that anyone has the authority or the ability to dictate what blockchain governance should be. I think that like we need to develop in an organic way. And, you know, I'm sorry that that doesn't give you much certainty, but I'm not sorry. Because if we tried to give you certainty, then you would use the blockchain to just like cause hell. Or maybe not you, but you know, it's very much opens that possibility. And I think that like the indeterminate position is actually much safer. than a system where you know for sure that you're going to have fully autonomous software, or you know for sure that a cartel of a few dudes who own most of the coins are going to control it, or you know for sure that like this corporation or that legal system has complete control of the blockchain. So the issue a lot of the time with trying to give an answer is that all the answers that we have available we know are wrong or not great, and so you got to spend more time looking. And I don't think that there's any answer that you can give me that says, okay, this is what blockchain governance should be like, that I won't be able to tear apart. You know, either because it's disenfranchising participants, because it's for sure going to lead to some capture, because it's for sure going to lead to some antisocial and anti-public kind of results. So it's really it's challenging, and I think that like we have a really good problem to solve, to try to figure out how we can make sure that the different stakeholders of blockchain governance are represented, how to make sure that we have legitimate blockchain governance institutions, how to make sure that we prevent disputes with existing legal systems, how do we make sure to prevent disputes between each other, how do we make sure that we can achieve our goals, you know, whatever those are, but without causing a whole bunch of collateral damage through the institution of radical prescriptions. So, you know, I think, you know, that we should resist the temptation to create certainty, to legitimize something just so that we can know how things happen, because what's going to happen if we do is that things will happen in a predictable way. And if we can predict that it's a bad way, then it's going to happen in that bad way, you know. So, you know, I think well, I mean, although I should take a step back from that because like anything that we institute could be delegitimized, it's just harder. It's harder to delegitimize things than it is to legitimize them in the first place. And so if we say, look, let's do coin voting, or let's have like this kind of norm, you know, it's really, really hard to let go. It's really hard to let go of Szabo's law. It's really hard. It would be really hard for us to abandon the EAPS process or the all devs call, because people kind of assume that we use these for coordination. So unless there's some kind of contentious crisis kind of event, it's really hard to change these things. So I think that, you know, if we institute and legitimize any governance regime, then we need to be really, really ready to live with the consequences. And I'm not ready to propose something that I'm happy to live with. But I know I'm not happy to live with fully autonomous software. And I'm confident to predict that, like, you know, most people also won't be. Hi, yeah.
Hi. Hi. Do you think that there are other ways or other types of political actions that exist than building autonomous code to reduce this distance between legal systems and the blockchain space?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are lots. I think it'd be really hard pressed to prove that there aren't any, because, like, I mean, it's such a radical minimization. You know, leaves a lot of room for for improvement. So, I mean, again, I can't give you any examples, but no examples.
Thanks. Hey, thanks for the talk. So you're kind of placing us in this like indeterminate position where, you know, let's explore is kind of one of the keys here. So it seems like in this like let's explore state, it's probably easier for someone to, let's say, capture the process than it is if we just say, okay, let's ruthlessly cut out all political process, right? So I guess the point I'm trying to make is that there are some set of trade-offs that come along with existing in this indeterminate state. What do you think they are, and how can we kind of try to avoid them?
I mean, anything becomes possible. And it's like scary, right? Although, of course, like, you know, acknowledging that everything is possible already is already scary enough, right? But having common knowledge that anything is possible, you know, opens up for possibilities that we don't like. But it also opens up possibilities that we do like, right? So I think we have to kind of understand that we need to remain vigilant so that we don't fall into the wrong outcomes, but that there's no way to create change without this kind of indeterminacy. And that change doesn't necessarily need to be preordained to the bad outcomes. We could easily be paranoid about the outcomes and imagine that for sure the worst one's going to happen. We could just as easily have faith that only the best ones are going to happen. And to be reasonable, we want to just exercise judgment and not race to conclusions around things are going to be terrible or that things are going to be utopic.
Thanks.
My pleasure.
Hi. So early on, you explained that the outcomes of how a blockchain is governed is crucial for some of the stakeholders. But do you even think that some stakeholders, but also people not actively participating in blockchain governance, that they have the information or guidelines or tools available to actually understand how the governance in some of these blockchains take place? And if not, should we do something about that?
Well, I mean, not only do they not understand how to participate in governance, but they probably don't even understand the fact that they are stakeholders of these decisions. And it can be really, really hard, really difficult to get participation from stakeholders who are affected by decisions, both because, it's hard to create governance institutions that allow for this contribution, and because it's a lot of, it's just really difficult to get people to participate in blockchain governance. I mean, I try to invite people, try to find someone to be in, to take an EAP for you from or to take some responsibility in blockchain governance. It's really kind of hard. And I think that it's going to get better over time. But it's definitely not a situation where we're even able to let everyone participate in blockchain governance. In some way, it's permissionless. Anyone can create a GitHub account and open an EAP, but that doesn't mean that it's accessible, right? Most people don't have the technical ability to represent their interests in blockchain governance discussions today. So it's definitely complicated, and I don't have a clear answer to that either.
So I want to thank you, first of all, and want to remind everybody about the context, that this isn't Vlad inventing indeterminacy. Indeterminacy is observed reality, and furthermore, the very idea of blockchain was an attempt to open up or reopen operating space and reopen indeterminacy. So if we go back to 2008, 2009, the Genesis blocks for blockchain, we had a system that wanted on-chain governance and on-chain reinforcement of existing financial institutions, and Bitcoin white paper was a response to that. So determinism and being locked into one particular governance vision was the status quo, and in many ways the Bitcoin white paper was an attempt to reopen this space. And so I find this really, really stimulating. But I would be really, I think it's really, really a bad outcome when people attach particular positions to individuals, right? That Zamfir is asking for indeterminacy or advocating for this particular position, where in reality, if we deconstruct it, it goes to the very, very Genesis block, which again, I find very, very stimulating and very invigorating. So thank you.
Maybe we can take one or two last questions.
I'm going to try and create some Vlad fences, but you're very good at avoiding them. I think that I heard you say, and this is sort of a follow-on from some of these other things, that you believe that stakeholders should make attempts to self-organize to participate in blockchain governance. Is that correct?
Well, to to signal their interest in blockchain governance, to do this, to participate in fork politics. So when you're talking about participating in blockchain governance, that could mean a good number of things, right? There's a lot of like positions in blockchain governance. Like you could be talking about someone operating a node, you could be talking about a developer, you could be talking about people participating in the kinds of fork politics that's much more accessible to...
Let me start with some definitions.
Yeah.
You mentioned a number of different groups of stakeholders. Basically, do you think those stakeholders, and let's be specific, should in fact be forming groups so that they can act as beyond single individuals in participating in governance of the Ethereum network?
Probably. I mean, if you're talking about from their personal strategic interests, yeah, probably.
Do you think that we have some responsibility, again, this nebulous we, that are interested in the Ethereum network, to encourage or signal that such groups should self-form?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's like just, I mean, to me, we don't even have to. They'll figure it out. But yeah, I mean, it seems like a good nudge to tell them that, like, you know, that if you're participating in blockchain governance, you should try to signal your position through political discourse.
Great, thank you.
Okay, one last question.
Thank you for the talk. In some cases, there are some disputes that the system cannot solve, the software cannot resolve. What do you think the software should do, and what should the community do?
And so when you say the system, do you mean blockchain governance?
I mean the fully autonomous software.
Fully autonomous software. Well, there's lots of disputes that fully autonomous software can't solve. And there's lots of disputes that we can't solve with blockchain governance. And sometimes there is genuinely nothing you can do. And that's very different from, you know, choosing not to do anything in order to minimize your liability. But when there's nothing you can do, the right thing to do is to, at least when someone's bringing you a dispute, is to tell them, sorry, there's nothing I can do, and to explain to them, you know, why there's nothing you can do.
Yeah, but sometimes it seems we still need a decision, right? Sometimes.
Well, there's nothing you can do, there's no decision, right? I'm not sure I understand your question anymore.
Yeah, okay. My next question is, do you think if we have a good fully autonomous software, ASIC could be like less important in it?
Sorry, what would be less important?
You mentioned the theory of ASICers, right?
Sorry? ASIC miners.
ASIC miners.
I don't remember mentioning ASIC miners. I don't know what ASIC miners have to do with this.
You talked something about the theory of ASICs during the talk, right?
Ethics.
Sorry, my English is not so good. So,
yeah.
I mean, do you think it will be the same, like equally important in the blockchain space as the real world, or do you think it is like less important?
Ethics or ASICs? Ethics. It's a good question. I mean, I hope that ethics is going to be a thing in blockchain governance. You know, knock on wood. I don't know. Yeah, sorry, I don't know. Great. Well, thanks everyone. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Coming out.